grab a seat. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello? You all here? Hi? Yes? Hi? My name is Suet-Fern, and I have the privilege of serving on the board of the World Justice Project. On behalf of the board members, our officers and our staff, I'd like to welcome you to our lunch event this afternoon. We will have a presentation on using data to expand access to justice. And today you will hear findings from the World Justice Project, Global Insights on Access to Justice, which actually represents findings on legal needs and access to civil justice based on surveys of some 100,000 households in 101 countries. Thank you also to the World Bank and the organizers of Law, Justice and Development Week. It's a real privilege for us to be sharing our data. For those of you who are new to the World Justice Project, and I met many of you who don't know much about us, we're an independent, multidisciplinary organization working to advance the rule of law around the world. And we do this in several ways. Firstly, by collecting and analyzing original independent rule of law data. There's still a few seats over here. Please do come and sit down. Don't go away. We're locking the doors. And we use this data for our Rule of Law Index. We have thematic reports on law topics like access to justice, and we have our subnational Mexican States Rule of Law Index too. Secondly, we support research, scholarship, and teaching about the rule of law, its relationship to development, and effective strategies to strengthen it. And finally, by building an engaged global network of policymakers and activists through strategic convenings like our biennial World Justice Forum, and I know some of you tell me you were there at The Hague this year. We have knowledge exchanges, coordinated campaigns, and locally led initiatives to advance the rule of law. Now, I'm sure all of you have your mobile devices here. Take them out. Take them out. You've got permission to take them out. Look us up. World Justice Project. Look us up. Because take them out. Come, it's all right. It's okay. Take your device out. Look us up. The World Justice Project has for over a decade worked to produce a universal definition of the rule of law. And you'll find it on our website. Please read it. We really encourage you to read it. We define the rule of law as a durable system of laws, institutions, and community commitment that delivers 4 universal principles. First, everyone is accountable under the law. The laws are clear, just, and evenly applied. The process of enacting, administering, and enforcing laws is open. And fourthly, justice is impartial and accessible to all. And today, we intend to focus on the 4th principle, access to justice. Access to justice is a fundamental component of the rule of law. The failure of justice systems to meet their citizens' justice needs compounds inequality, erodes trust in institutions, and renders societies vulnerable to a populist backlash against core rule of law norms. And we see that happening in many parts of the world today. The study you will hear about is our first-hand effort to capture comparable data on legal needs and access to civil justice on a global scale. It is the kind of effort that can help us all understand better how people experience justice to solve their everyday needs and allocate scarce resources to address the most pressing needs. Our program today will consist of two parts. First, Alejandro Ponce, our Chief Research Officer, who does just absolutely incredible work, will provide an overview of the study and key insights. Secondly, we will hear a brief commentary from our panelists, moderated by the World Justice Project Executive Director, Betsy Andersen. Then they will try and contextualize these findings, and time permitting, we'll have lots of questions from all of you in the audience. Finally, our next edition of the Rule of Law Index will be released in a few months in March 2020. And if you have your devices out, please subscribe to us so that you can receive the Rule of Law Index and all our other mailings. And we just have some incredible material that is very useful to participants here. This is an addition there, so please come and subscribe to us. I'd like to thank you all again for coming to this session, and please enjoy your lunch. We collect lots of data, but we are not analyzing how many calories there are in the tiramisu, so enjoy it all, please. Alejandro.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Fern. Let me just start with a personal story to set the tone of the data that we're going to see. A few years ago, many years ago, when my father passed away, I remember that my mom trying to recover part of the pension fund that my dad had. It was a small amount, but it's something that he earned through the years. So we went to the bank. The bank told us that we couldn't do it, that we couldn't get the money. Then we started speaking to people, and they told us that we had to go to an administrative tribunal to get the funds from the Social Security Administration. And at some point, my mom got discouraged. She was just dealing with the loss. And she said, I don't want to do this. I don't care. So we never saw that money. So if you think about it, just that case never went to court. Just we never saw, doesn't appear in the statistics, or maybe in some, just of funds that were not recovered. But it speaks about a fundamental issue that I think it's at the core of the work that we're doing here, all of us, and that we're going to present as well, which is two things. So the first one is that when we talk about justice, people have to be at the center of justice. We have to think about people-centered justice, not institution-centered justice, but people-centered justice. Number two is that justice actually affects people's lives. Justice is not simply an outcome, just that we observe, but it actually has effects over health, income, that eventually affect development. So just bringing that link between justice and development, that's something that brings us, all of us here, together. What I'm presenting here today is an effort which many people have participated, and it's an effort to try to bring some light on the situation around the world around these topics. So it's an effort of gathering information from more than 100,000 people of the problems that they face on their daily lives that have a legal dimension. They may not necessarily end up in courts, but that have a legal dimension and then somehow affects them. So the background of this, as we heard, the World Justice Project produces every year an index to measure adherence to the rule of law around the world. And one of the data sources used for this index is a general population poll. In every country that we index, we interview 1,000 people on their perceptions and experiences around a variety of topics related to the rule of law. But this presented an opportunity to pilot questions about access to justice. So these are some pictures so you get a sense of the data collection efforts in a variety of countries. Mozambique, Nepal, Bulgaria, Mexico, Afghanistan. The story of this is the following. So we said, okay, so we're doing this data collection effort, so why don't we include a set of questions that allow us to assess how regular people in all these countries experience legal problems and what they do about them. So this is in the same tradition of the legal needs surveys that some countries have been doing over the years, but the efforts have been scattered and usually not standardized. So we said, why don't we use this exercise to develop a model that allows us to obtain this information for a large number of countries in a standardized way. So to set the tone of what's the situation very broadly about issues in different countries around the world. So we designed these questions, and then we included these questions. The questions are overall 118 questions. We thought that there were going to be fewer, but we realized that there are many issues and that we wanted to get a lot of information. So we ended up with 118 questions that are organized as follows. So the first one is the types of problems that people may have. So we don't ask about legal problems. We ask about problems that lay people may understand, whether you had a problem with your neighbor or a problem just accessing government payments or a problem with your child at the school. We define them just approximately 50 different countries, 50 different problems that were somehow common in different countries around the world, land issues, even illegal payment issues. Then we start asking about how serious the problem is for each one of the problems identified by people, and then whether people went to get help, whether people solve or didn't solve the problem, how did they solve it? Did they actually solve the problem? Or just they got something, just a decision, but the problem was not really solved? Where did they go? How it ended? The quality of the process that they faced, the legal capability of all these people when facing this problem, and some questions about impact as well of the problem or assessment of impact. So here's a little bit of the detail. I don't expect, I cannot see it, I don't expect that you see it. But it's more or less what I was talking about. So which is experience, sources of help, legal capability, taking actions, seriousness, process, and impact. The development, as I was saying, so there was a pilot. So we tested this in 61 countries first in 2016, and then started an exercise to develop questions together with groups convened by Open Society Justice Initiative and the OECD to figure out what was the most effective and efficient way to do this. There was a guide, actually, that was produced by these organizations that serves as a guidance for countries that want to do these kind of exercises and that want to include a model, a smaller model, in their household surveys or data collection efforts. So rather than simply doing a major exercise, that they can include simply a model and then include justice in development surveys. So finally, just the final data collection was done in 2017 and 2018 in 101 countries, 1,000 people in each one of the countries. Admittedly, this is a small sample compared to a lot of the legal needs surveys that have been conducted in other parts of the world, but it's the first one to actually give us a global view in a large number of countries for these issues. In the books that you have now in the floor, but just they were in your chairs, you can see the country profile. So just that's how we summarize information just for a large number of countries with an effort to present as much information as possible in an organized way. You can also, now that you have your phones outside, you can also check the portal online where you can see all the information for all the different countries online. And rather than going through the country profiles, let me present some global findings. Finding number one is that legal problems are ubiquitous. They are present in all countries, in most socioeconomic levels, or in all socioeconomic levels. You will see the map there of all the countries that were included in the exercise. The prevalence varies, but on average, half of the people in the world experience a legal problem in the last 2 years. Number two, problems vary across countries, naturally. Countries are different, problems vary as well. But some problems are more common than others, and some are more serious than others. In all countries in the world, the most common problem is consumer problems, just faulty goods or problems that you may have with a utility provider. But in all problems, in all countries in the world as well, there are a lot of issues that are serious and that are pervasive. Number three, low-income people experience more problems. So what you see here, it's a difference by the people who receive government benefits, which is a proxy, and this exercise we have done it with different demographics, but this is a simple one, just people who receive government benefits versus those who don't. And in all countries, you will see that the people who receive government benefits in general tend to have more problems than those who do not receive government benefits. 4, most people do not turn to court and lawyers. So in many cases, people have a problem and they go, in some cases, they go to other institutions. In some other cases, they do nothing. So 33% direct agreement with the other party, independent action by one of the parties, 19%, and just in some cases, just waiting that the problem sorts itself out, 16%. Then, as I was saying before, the justice problems actually impact people's lives. What we see here, we ask questions about the impact of the problem for people, their perception about how their problem affected their lives. And we have questions about whether people got ill because of it, or whether they lost income, or whether there was a relationship breakdown. And you will see that just the percentages on average, for example, 43% of people experience some sort of hardship, either illness, losing a job, breaking a relationship, or even in some cases using alcohol or drugs. Now, what I'm presenting now is what we present in the country profiles, but looking at a global level. So as I was saying before, so these are the 5 sections that we have in the country profile. So in the 100 countries, as I was saying before, 49% of people experience a legal problem in the last 2 years. Legal capability, 63% of people knew where to get information or felt they could get, 52% felt they could get all the help that they wanted. So this is a proxy for whether people were capable of dealing with the problem and using actually the expert help that they needed, and then confidence. Sources of help, only 29% of people got access to help, and in many cases they simply go to friends and family. But there are follow-up questions on the reasons why they didn't get access to help. In some cases, it's simply because the problem was easy, they didn't need it, but in some others, it's because of serious barriers. They didn't know where to get information, they didn't know who to go, they were afraid of it, it was very expensive, so all of that, it's there. Finally, just what happened to the problem, if it's fully resolved or not. So we picked a horizon of 2 years. And in many cases, even if the problem, people say that they are done with the problem, in many cases, the problem actually persists. Finally, process, 67% felt that the process to resolve the problem was fair. And this is not necessarily only a judicial process. You can think about informal mechanisms, administrative mechanisms, mediation, or dealing with the other party, just but the perception of fairness, as well as time, 7.6 months on average, and the cost, some proxies, qualitative proxies of the cost of the financial difficulty to solve the problem. Finally, just what I was mentioning before, 43% of people experience some sort of hardship. Now, as I was mentioning at the beginning, this is simply a first glimpse of the problem, something that we have seen just by looking at the data, by looking at this issue, is that there is still a lot of things that we don't know and that we need to explore. And here are simply 6 things that we think that we as a community should move forward, and WJP in particular is moving forward during the next year. So the first one is obviously more analysis of the database. So what I showed you was global trends, but there are very interesting results when we try to break this down by demographics or trying to understand whether institutional structures imply some sort of impact or have differences in the outcomes observed. Something that I showed you was simply aggregate figures, but we need to come up with indicators for access to justice. So we want to know whether people who actually had better access to justice have different outcomes, for example. So that's something that we will like to know. We need to couple this with qualitative research and, interestingly, try to understand what works, what doesn't, what are the policy interventions, top-down, bottom-up, that work or don't work, and how they work. So we need to do more work, impact evaluations of these kind of programs in the same spirit as development economics and public health does it. So related to this, we want to, if we want to make the case for investment and understanding what's the impact of the different interventions, how costly they are, and whether they are cost-effective. So we need to conduct cost-benefit analysis for the different programs, interventions, not only on justice outcomes, but also on development outcomes. So building the capacity of governments to produce and use justice data. We showed an exercise that we have conducted, but ideally we would like governments to conduct these kind of exercises, do assessments with these, combine it with the data that they already have. We don't want to continue producing this kind of data. We would like that governments actually just produce this on a more massive scale and use it. And then obviously just in the context of the SDGs, working with countries to measure progress towards the target 16.3. There are proposals on building an indicator on access to justice that could actually serve as an interesting leverage for countries to promote access to justice. Thank you very much, and I'm going to give the floor to Betsy Andersen to continue with the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Betsy Andersen. I'm the Executive Director of the World Justice Project. And as Alex just outlined, we have just started this work. We have much to do to understand this data, including some qualitative research about the context in which the data is present, and the kinds of solutions that we can bring to address the justice gap. So we're going to have a little focus group here right in front of your eyes. And I'm pleased to have 3 members of the World Justice Project Board of Directors who are in town this week to join me on the panel for a discussion about the data in 3 very different contexts. And then we hope we can open the floor and get your thoughts as well. So if I could invite my colleagues up. So I'm very pleased to be joined here on the dais. To my immediate left is William Hubbard, the chair of the board of the World Justice Project and a partner at the Shepard Mullen firm and also past president of the American Bar Association. Nelson Mullins. My bad. And to William's left, I have John Nery, also a member of the board of the World Justice Project and a columnist with the Philippine Daily Inquirer. And on my far left, Mondli Makhanya, who is the editor of the City Press in a newspaper in South Africa. So if I can begin, gentlemen, with an opening question about the data. We have profiles of data from each of your countries in this 101-country report, and I'd be interested in what you take from the data about the context in which you live and work. And maybe I can start with you, William.
Well, the discouraging thing about where the United States stands in these types of studies and this data collection is how poorly we perform. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and yet we ranked 102 out of 126 countries on accessibility and affordability of essential civil legal services. That's a disgrace, and that's why we need to be thinking most creatively about totally restructuring and re-regulating the delivery of legal services in the United States. So right now we're among the poorest performers in these categories, and this is something that has gotten the attention of bar leaders and judges and state Supreme Courts across the United States, and I can talk a little bit about some of the more positive developments and perhaps new platforms for delivery of services as we go forward a little bit later in the program.
All right, John, can we turn to you? What jumps out at you from the data on the Philippines?
The Duterte presidency is premised on a law and order problem. His signature policy is the so-called war on illegal drugs. If you look at the data, which was collected only in the last couple of years when Duterte was already president, it seems that the data do not bear this focus out. For instance, you have to look hard to find instances of substance abuse as one of the issues leading to a legal case. I think that you're looking at community and natural resources. That's where it's filed under possible case of substance abuse. Only about 7% of Filipinos say they have a problem like this. And only 2% have a problem with being arrested without justification or beaten up by law enforcement officials. Duterte rode the peace and order problem all the way to the presidential palace. What I find striking, though, is that if you look at, incidentally, the data on the Philippines is on page 85. If you look at the hardship statistics, turns out that lack of access to justice led to 10% of the respondents falling into substance abuse. Okay, it says right there they had problems with liquor or drugs as a result of this lack of access to justice. I know it's difficult to compare, but what Alejandro pointed out earlier, the global average is 6% as far as substance abuse as hardship is concerned. So that's the first thing that struck me. The system itself in the Philippines might be actually a cause of the illegal drugs problem.
Very interesting. Okay, Mondli, looking at the data from South Africa, what do you see?
I know you said I'm on the far left. I just want to assure the audience that it doesn't reflect my ideological position. Yeah. Look, it's not surprising at all. South Africa does rank as one of the most unequal societies on earth. And that is a function partially of where we come from. We went through a system that ended in 1994, so there's a lot of remnants of that. There was a process of trying to rectify that, trying to create a state that matters, a system that is very people-centered. But we have also gone through a period, maybe the past decade or so, of extreme corruption where the state was overtaken by certain interests which diverted public funds elsewhere, whereas the state ceased to care about the people. So you've had a breakdown in the social fabric. You had a breakdown in the state's ability to care. You had a breakdown in infrastructure. You had a breakdown in basically in the state's ability to carry out its duties. And that affected directly people's access to justice in all its forms, access to facilities, access to legal justice. And when you then couple that, the collapse of the state with the inequality that continues to persist in the country, that is a recipe for a failure for people to access justice.
Okay. I'm going to stay with you, Mondli, and come back down the road this way. Looking at the South Africa data, one of the things that jumps out at me is the hardship that people experience because of their justice problem. We heard from Alex that globally it's around 30% of respondents who had a hardship consequence due to their justice problem. But in South Africa, it's 54% of the respondents, over half, who experienced some type of hardship, and 36% who experienced a physical or stress-related health problem due to their justice problem. Why do you think this is such striking data coming out of South Africa in terms of the consequence that people suffer?
Okay, again, not very surprising. Just to relate two areas of access to justice. One is relating to crime. Because of inequalities, I'm sure some of you will be aware that we do experience quite a high level of crime in the country. And once a year, the police, the government and the police, they issue crime statistics, which are very comprehensive, and they're presented to Parliament and to the media in a very grand way, and they paint a very, very minute and granular picture of the crime situation in the country. And then, again, later on in the year, the Statistics South Africa, the General Statistician of South Africa, issues something called Victims of Crime Survey, which is now usually about a year out of date, but it's something where they go out, the Statistician General goes out and they interview people about how they actually experience crime generally. Now, those statistics are usually much higher than the statistics that the police issue. Because people, and what we take away from that is that people basically give up on trying to report crimes because their level of confidence in the criminal justice system is very low. They do not trust the police, they do not trust the prosecutorial authority, and as a result, they do not trust the courts. Not that the courts are bad, I mean, the South African courts are generally very good, but because the outcome at the end, it's the courts, people will say the courts do not mete out justice. So people lack the confidence in the system, and so they'll just let it go. So the trust levels are very, very, very low, and people will then end up just, I mean, like it affects you ultimately because you are suffering inside, and you are not getting the outcome that you expect from the justice system. Then the second one is access to justice in a much more social way. Your access to health, access to education, access to other social services. Now, because of the breakdown of the state, people at the lowest level of society do not have anybody to turn to, and a lot of them just sit back, and particularly the poorest in the rural areas, and they are not able to voice their opinions about how to. They are not able to make a noise about how to get services delivered to them, and they then turn to NGOs, and we are fortunate to have a very strong civil society culture in South Africa, and they take on the government in a very strong way, right up to the Constitutional Court, forcing them to deliver services to the people. In the urban areas, what the poor people do is that because of our history in the past, history of protests, there's a lot of protests. Every single day when you turn on the radio on your way to work, you want the traffic report will tell you, do not take this particular highway because people are protesting. And what I'm going to say next is not going to make sense to you, and it's going to make you think that we are abnormal, but we've never claimed to be abnormal. We have a very unique thing in South Africa in that when people protest, particularly in the urban areas, let's say they're not getting access, the local clinic is not working, they'll go and burn down the local school. And when then the government takes a long time to fix the local school, so they'll dig up the road. And then the government does not fix the road on time, and then they'll go and attack some other government facility because they feel there's no ownership of the state yet. People still relate to the state as they did to the old apartheid government. In a way, there's no ownership of the state. So there's a big gap between how people relate to what should be their government, what should be their state.
Okay, really interesting, and a theme of trust there that I want to pick up with you, John. In the Philippines, we've seen, as we've seen in many places around the world, a rise of populism. And I wonder what your thoughts are about the relationship between populism in the Philippines or elsewhere and this justice gap. Is there a link between a lack of trust in institutions that we're seeing in this data and populism?
Thank you. I think, populism is a tricky concept. It is both well-defined and contested. I find it helps to think of it as three different things. It is substance, it is style, and it is strategy. There is a line of research that describes President Duterte's appeal to the public as penal populism. What unites all the three different types, three different strands of populism is the overriding concept of a dichotomy in society. There is the pure people, and then there is the despised other. And most of us, I would think of this in terms of the masses and an unreachable, unaccountable elite. Duterte's rise to power is based partly on that, but it is also based on a different dichotomy. There is the pure people, and then there are the hardened criminals. So this is a very productive, very fertile line of research that considers not what is called the upward focus, but the downward focus of populism. So Duterte has never in our surveys has peace and order been in the top three concerns. The same surveys that show that President Duterte is very popular also show that Filipinos are mostly concerned about livelihood issues, inflation, wages, and so on and so forth. Peace and order, I think at the highest has ranked 6th or 7th. And yet he was able to harness people's frustration about peace and order and ride that horse all the way to the presidential palace. So I think that there is in fact a link between this justice gap as indicative of a wider system of inequality in the Philippines and the rise of a populist politician like Duterte.
Okay. Really interesting research topic for you, Alex. William, I want to turn to you. We are preoccupied with finding solutions to this justice gap. And that's something that has been a focus of yours as well here in the United States, and particularly as the leader, president of the American Bar Association. You established a commission on the future of legal services, a center for innovation grew out of that work to, among other things, tackle this problem. Tell us about what you are learning from that effort.
Thank you, Betsy. Well, what we're learning is we're being reinforced. Our learning is being reinforced. There's really a cultural barrier to the progress that we're trying to make. Unfortunately, many lawyers see innovation in the delivery of legal services as a threat to their livelihood. And so that's a constant strain, and we also have a regulatory structure that does not encourage innovation, and I'll elaborate on that point in just a moment. But let me put a little more granularity on our problem in the United States. 80% of the poor in the United States of America do not have adequate access to civil legal services. Over 50% of those in the middle income range do not have adequate access to civil legal services. In 3/4 of the states in the United States, and the state courts are where most all of the action is in terms of civil services or civil actions. In 3/4 of the states, one party or the other is not represented by a lawyer. And yet we have a system of very complex rules written decades ago by lawyers for lawyers, based on the premise that everyone coming into court would have a lawyer. And that's simply not the reality today. And so that fact and that understanding compels us to think differently about how we ought to approach the delivery of legal services. I contend, and others do as well, that all of this lack of access to justice is an essential violation of the promises of the United States Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, established justice. It was the first priority in the preamble to the United States Constitution, adopted over 200 years ago. But we're not doing that. We're not honoring that promise. We need not to do away with all regulation of delivery of legal services, because some regulation is there to protect the public, to protect consumers from the bad delivery of legal services or the artificial delivery of legal services. But we do need re-regulation of legal services to promote innovation and make sure that we're protecting consumers. Betsy referred to the ABA Commission on the Future of Legal Services. And in that report, which was issued in 2016 and is still online, we urged that procedures for judicial authorization and regulated legal services providers be developed in the states, and the success of those programs be monitored to see which of the programs were effective. But let me give you some examples of what's going on in some of the states that are innovative and where legal services are being delivered, but not necessarily by lawyers. There are courthouse navigators and housing and consumer court advocates in New York. There are courthouse facilitators in California and Washington State. There are limited practice officers in Washington State. There are limited licensed legal technicians in Washington State. There are courthouse advocates in New Hampshire and document preparers in Arizona, California, and Nevada. Utah and some other states, Arizona, they're looking very comprehensively at ways to do something to close this justice gap, to be more creative in the way that we authorize people to deliver legal services. One other problem that we have is our rules that govern lawyers' conduct. There's Model Rule 5.4, which has essentially been adopted in just about all of the states in some form or another, provides that lawyers cannot share fees with or have their practices, have investment in their practices and their law practices by non-lawyers. So that keeps an infusion of capital from coming into the legal delivery system. And it's up to the lawyers then to finance the innovation. And it's also prohibitive of technologists and young innovators to join law firms as partners. That's not allowed in any state of the United States. It is allowed in the District of Columbia. I'd like to quote from a recent book by Justice Gorsuch, which just was released a month or so ago. And he said, all else being equal, market participants with greater access to capital can increase output and lower price. So, for example, optometry, dental, and tax preparation services are no doubt cheaper and more ubiquitous today thanks to the infusion of capital from investors outside those professions. Now, the UK understood this and in 2007 permitted multidisciplinary forms of practice, alternative business structures. And all of the dire predictions that consumers would be harmed by these ABS, the alternative business structure firms, have proven to have not come to fruition. There's been no material, there's no data that's shown that the public has been harmed by these alternative business structures. There's also the problem of the unauthorized practice of law in just about in every state in the United States. And again, for those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. legal system, we regulate the delivery of legal services. We regulate lawyers at the state level, not at the federal level. And so the rules are state rules. Most states have UPL, or unauthorized practice of law, restrictions on those who can practice or deliver legal services. In 2007 in the UK, the burden of proof was shifted, and legal services are allowed to be delivered by anyone except those who accept those services that are specifically reserved to lawyers. And so it's up to the burden of proof is not to prove that you're not delivering legal services. It's presumed to be okay to deliver those services unless there's a clear understanding that those services have been reserved. The state of Utah has come up with something I think is very creative, and they've established what they call a regulatory sandbox. They're allowing innovation to occur within the protection of a sandbox where you cannot be accused of practicing law in an unauthorized fashion or violating any of the ethical rules, so that they can nurture the innovation and see if some of these new platforms for delivery of legal services will help close this justice gap. All of this is consistent with some famous language Justice Brandeis stated in a decision in the 1930s in the U.S. Supreme Court. He was a U.S. Supreme Court justice, and he referred to the states as the laboratories of innovation for social and economic and legal reform. And that's what a lot of us in the American Bar Association and in other organizations are trying to promote, that kind of innovation that will allow legal services to be delivered in new ways in a less restrictive way and taking better advantage of technology.
Okay, I'm going to open it up here in a minute for questions of Alex regarding the data, or our panelists about their observations on the context for the justice gap. But while you're thinking about your question, let me pose one more to the group. Any of you can answer, or all of you. This is a conference this week, Law, Justice, and Development Week, focused on technology and the law. What role can technology play in solving this problem? What are the limits of technology? What are some of the challenges of technology in this context? Any of you?
I'll just briefly state that online dispute resolution is a hot topic in the U.S. How do we create algorithms, and there's some private companies that have done so, where you can actually go online and work through an algorithm and it'll decide the dispute for you through a decision tree process. A number of companies have grown out of this kind of strategy. And it's a valuable strategy, and there's a place for it. And people are using those alternative legal service provider companies that are technology focused. There are, however, limitations to access to the internet and to computers by a vast swath of the population. I'm proud that the law school from which I graduated has just bought and is refurbishing a bus. They're calling it the Justice Bus. And that bus will go to the most remote areas of our state with law students and law professors and volunteer lawyers. Park that bus in a church parking lot or a strip mall parking lot and deliver legal services in the old-fashioned way by meeting with people and helping to solve their problems that way. I think it takes all of those different components to have a successful delivery system.
John?
Two quick points. I think that smartphones might be a way to bridge the justice gap. We've seen that happen as far as mobile banking technology is concerned in remote parts of the world, even in the Philippines. My second point, though, I'd have to bring out the limitation. Cell phone use in the Philippines is over 100%, but only about 55% of the cell phones are smartphones. The rest are, old cell phones and so on. So I'm worried about just suggesting smartphone technology innovation and unthinkingly maybe even creating a new divide, between the ones with smartphones and the ones without.
Mondli, any thoughts on?
Yeah, just to add on to what John was saying, I think not necessarily the smartphone, but the cell phone. I think it has been a major tool of leapfrogging the big gap that existed between the haves and the have-nots, and it has been used. I mean, like in South Africa, it has been used immensely in terms of accessing medical services, health services, accessing any other social services. So it has been very good with that. And it is a very basic technology, but a very effective one. But it's also a double-edged sword. And we have experienced some unfortunate incidents where it has also been used to spread panic, particularly among people who want to deal with problems that they have. When people have not been able to access justice, particularly in relation to crime, then they will name somebody, and that person then becomes the victim of mob justice. And once it spreads, you cannot stop it. So it's as I said, it's a double-edged.
Yeah. Okay, let me open it up for questions from the audience. And I think we have a microphone coming here. If you could just identify yourself and pose your question, please.
Sure. My name is Diya Basu from the American University here in DC. My question is to Alexis. Yeah, about the data. I'm a little surprised about the figures from India, just because they seem a little low in terms of how many people, the percentage of people that faced legal problems. And I just took a very quick look at your research methods and methodology, so I could be wrong. But while it may seem equitable to have 1,000 people in every single country, in reality, when you have a country with a population of 300,000 and you have another country with a population of 1.3 billion, then that 1,000 across countries doesn't seem, and I wanted to know how you arrived at that magic number of 1,000. I'm trying to remember my research methods class, and what's that magic number that you get when the statistical significance, what's that number that you choose when you decide to say that, yes, okay, this is a nationally representative sample? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. As I was saying, just the motivation of the study, or the way that the study started, was a way to piggyback on the exercise that we were doing for the Rule of Law Index. So in that case, we're doing 1,000 interviews in each country that for the index essentially aggregates into an aggregated score. But we saw this as an opportunity to collect information on this topic in a standardized way. Now, as I was saying, usually the legal needs surveys require a much larger sample because a lot of the issues just depend on the previous answers. So, for example, if you experienced a problem, then I want to know what happened with the problem and whether you went to a lawyer and how expensive was the lawyer and so on. Suddenly you start reducing the sample substantially. So usually the sample sizes of these studies are just above 5,000 people. So this study from that point of view is smaller. So the advantage is that it's standardized and it's done for a larger number of countries. The intention was to set a baseline so to build on it. Now, to the specific question about just the sample size in India, I think it really depends on two things. So one is just how representative the sample is, so how it is selected, and just how heterogeneous the country is. So if the country is very heterogeneous, then obviously you require larger samples to capture that heterogeneity, and also just the inferences that you want to make about the specific groups, the smaller groups. If you're interested in the smaller populations, you need larger samples. So then the sample was representative, so it was randomly selected and so on, but still we know that India is a very diverse country and may not necessarily capture all the heterogeneity, but the way that it's selected was randomly, just which assures at least the representativeness of the 1,000 people.
Other questions? One here.
Yes, hi, it's Val Okaru-Bicent. And I have like 2-3 questions. The first one is the demographics of your 1,000 respondents sample. Mm-hmm. Did you take into consideration, of course, women and, of course, youth? And how did you spread it out? How did you divide that? And then the second question I had was, I noticed that I'm looking at Nigeria and South Africa primarily, right? And I'm looking at the way you divided in terms of legal problems. There's some, in terms of the category that you use, the criteria, so to speak. I know you have like 12, right? I went to page 121, so I noticed you listed all of them. But I found some things missing, and then I found that water is included under your community and natural resources, but then you lumped it with gangs. I'm wondering if some things didn't fall through the cracks, because I'm looking at your the percentage you have in terms of 60% legal problems, and there's no water as a separate category, there's no food, there's no health. But then you have health on the hardship. So the health is a hardship, but then it's not a legal problem. So I'm just wondering how you decided to exclude it under that criteria, but then you put it under the hardship, and then the water was lumped with the gangs and all that. So, and then the demographics. Yeah? Okay. Thank you so much.
So let me give the microphone to Sarah Long. She coordinated the effort.
Hi. Hi, I'm Sarah Long. I'm the Director for Access to Justice Research at the World Justice Project, and I manage the polls and in part the development of the survey. So to answer the question about demographic groups, we create quotas in every country. So we have a gender quota, quota for age, and quota by income groups as well. And these are set using national statistics. So before we start fieldwork, we work with local polling companies. They gather the national statistics, and based on what those say, they decide how to basically stratify the sample. So that is taken into consideration, and that is a way that we can cut the data. In terms of how we group problems, this actually came from guidance developed by the Open Society Justice Initiative and the OECD. So basically, they created this guidance document that collects information from over 30 different legal needs surveys that have been conducted over the past 25 years, and it takes inventory of what are all of the possible types of legal problems that you can ask about in a survey survey, and how do you group those into broader categories? So we kind of followed that taxonomy to group them, but we do ask about 38 different problem types, and kind of the way we group them into 12 categories for the purposes of fitting them on the country profile was kind of following that guidance. However, you mentioned this longer list in the back of the publication where you can see all 38. If you go to our website, you can actually download the summary statistics that show the proportion for each of those. So if you really do want to look specifically at water within land and resources, you can download the summary statistics and see that information. And then within health, we have health, I believe it's listed under public services. Problems accessing healthcare is listed under public services, and then separately we ask about it as a hardship as well. So it does appear in both places, and you can get kind of more granularity on the specific problems by downloading the summary statistics.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to go over this side. Maybe I will collect 3 questions, and we'll come back then for answers.
Hello. So another question about the data. 2 quick ones then. First one, it's a bit of understanding of the comparability issues that you have across countries. Of course, you can read the data within each country, and that's very valuable, and that's a very commendable task that you have engaged in. But of course, you also aggregate it and discuss it in general terms. So this is very complex once you have underlying conditions that are very different, and the understanding of the legal problems that you face are very different also, and the expectation that you have of what type of solution to have, it's very different. So this aggregation, I want to understand how you think about it. And the next part, also connected to the inference, is that you also have a causality story here, because you go from the information of the hardship and all the process to, from the legal problem that people understand they have to a hardship at the end. And this is also very problematic because, of course, you are not controlling for many other things and things. So I want to understand how you view this. And, of course, it's also more complex because you're aggregating it and then it generates, again, the same problem. Thank you.
Okay, great. That's the first question. Hang on to that, and we'll gather a couple more here. Right here.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. My name is Mpoi Kamulai. I am teaching law and practicing law in the Congo. And before that, I used to be one of the lawyers in this house. And now I have a couple of maybe comments, I should put it this way. We're talking about these world projects, and I looked at the Congo, and I saw that it is part of the 101 countries. My first question was, in the Congo, like in many other places, we have a problem of language. We have 4 major so-called national languages. We use French as the official language. Law is totally administered in French. And there is a huge gap between how French is spoken now, and I'm a lawyer and I'm teaching, and even my own students have a very difficulty mastering the language now. So access to justice and its particular problems is not only peculiar to the Congo. I think in Africa is a major issue that we have this gap between the official language and the language that people are using. I may be interested to learn from other countries, particularly in the Nordic countries where they use their own languages, but they are also very fluent in English. The second point of interest to me is how are you, the World Justice Project, being financed? And because I have struggled to put up a coalition, what we call Coalition for Justice and Peace in Africa, as a grassroots organization, because without justice, without the rule of law, peace cannot happen, development is just wishful thinking. So And I've been confronting a great challenge in raising funds to do this. So I wanted to get those specifics. Thank you very much.
Excellent. A last question, and then we'll get answers.
Thank you. My name is Emilio Viano, and I have a basic question. We are talking about access to justice, but I have not heard any definition of it. What does it mean? That you live near the courthouse, that they speak your language, or that you have enough money to go to court, and then to sustain maybe the appeal process afterward? What is access to justice? And finally, I would like to know what your project does with the data. Is it just to publish a book, very nice, with lots of color, or is something done after? Thank you.
Okay, so Alex, maybe I can start with you on the question about the definition of justice and the question about the comparability of the data and aggregation and methodology.
Okay, so let me start with the one about aggregation and about causality. You're absolutely right. What I presented here was just simply the aggregation just of the entire data set, the averages by country, right? But the value here is really on the country-by-country experiences. And even though I will be cautious about the inferences that we can make to derive policy. So I think that you're right. I mean, the issues, we need to take into account the context, what people understand by each one of the problems, why they are acting in this particular way in a particular country. And then we use a standardized categories that, as Sarah was mentioning, were drawn from a literature review of everything that has been done on the topic. But still, we know that many things are contextual. So our intention here is that this is a first step towards trying to understand the situation in a country better. But by no means is the last word on it. On the contrary, it's just a motivation for further exploration. This is something that we're currently doing just at a much larger scale in Mexico, in which we are doing this with 25,000 people and then accompanying this with qualitative research by journalists as well, partnering with a news outlet to actually just figuring out really what you mean by when people answer these questions. Then on the issue, and the purpose here is actually just, we're doing research to use this information on a cross-country basis, but simply as the first study or the basis for more micro-studies moving forward. On the causality, absolutely, we're not trying to infer causality from here. It's simply just to highlight that there is a association of what people say. That's what I said, just how they perceive it, whether they actually attribute this to the problem, but it's just simply based on the attribution of what people say. There is by no means causality. That's what I said at the end, that moving forward, we would like to work more on impact studies and not only looking at the impact of the problems, but more interestingly, the impact of interventions to solve the problems. And this takes me to the second point of justice. What exactly we mean by justice? So I will not try to define justice here. So the human race has tried for many years, but just what we have here is we have several questions that I mentioned in the process: accessing a mechanism, having access to legal aid, and so on. Now, the issue here is just how can we develop an indicator of justice, just a metric whether people have access or not. We have done an exercise trying first different indicators. So let's look at an indicator of legal capability. Let's look at an indicator of access to a lawyer and if they have access to a lawyer or not. Then let's look at an indicator whether they went to a mechanism or not, or whether they consider the process fair or not. So really what we found most compelling was a multidimensional measure. So what we are working right now, and we have tested it, and right now we're working on analyzing the different outcomes by splitting the sample using this indicator. Is an indicator following the tradition of the multidimensional poverty index, understanding that justice is multidimensional and creating an index based on the responses of legal capability, legal aid, fairness, cost, time, etc. And that actually seems to make much more sense just from the data point of view or from a conceptual point of view. So then to your question, just based on some of the questions that we have about accessibility, legal capacity, legal aid, and process, an outcome, we have developed an indicator that it's a proxy for access to justice that we want to use to analyze this data further.
Let me jump in and answer a couple of the questions about WJP, and then I want to come back to our panel with a question about language and access to justice and your perspective on that and any final observations you may have. About WJP financing, we are funded, like many nonprofit organizations, by a combination of government and intergovernmental organization, donor agencies, foundations, and individual philanthropists. And that information is on our website, our donors, as well as in the publication. And as for your own Coalition for Justice and Peace, congratulations. That sounds like a marvelous initiative. I would invite you, also on our website is a resource hub of a list of organizations that are working throughout the world to advance rule of law, and we would welcome the inclusion of the coalition among those organizations and working with you to connect you to those who may have resources to support those efforts. I want to circle back to the question about what do you do with all of this data? So the World Justice Project's mission is to create knowledge, build awareness, and stimulate action for the rule of law. So the data is just step one, and that is the knowledge creation. But we are very eager to raise awareness of this work, and that's part of what we're doing here today, putting it in the hands of committed and interested folks like all of you to act on it, and then working in partnership with many folks to drive action on this agenda. And some of them are here. We've got in the room representatives of the Pathfinders for Just, Peaceful, and Inclusive Societies, which has been led, of course, in their task force on justice by the governments of the Netherlands, Sierra Leone, and Argentina. They've been really important partners with us in raising awareness of the justice gap that this data reveals, but even more important, driving an action agenda, policy agenda at national and local levels to begin to implement some of the ideas that folks up here and in other fora have been highlighting as solutions. So we welcome that partnership with all of you as well, and I hope this is the beginning of a conversation. And let me turn now to our panel for any concluding remarks about this agenda, and in particular, any answers and reflections you have about the particular justice challenge of language.
As a as journalist writing for an English language newspaper in the Philippines, I am very conscious of the question of language. And law in the Philippines is also largely written in English, and not just any kind of English. It's bad lawyers' English, all the cliches and so on. So I have no doubt, I have no statistical data to back me up, but I have no doubt that if there is a feeling of estrangement from the law with access to justice, I have no doubt that language is part of the problem.
In South Africa, we have 11 official languages, and they are all equal. So, but obviously, English will be the dominant language of government, of administration, of everything. But you, as an individual, have the right to access any document in the language of your choice. So the state is obliged and forced to provide that to you. And in the courts, the same thing. A court case, or civil or criminal, you will speak in your language, and the state is obliged to provide those services, and your charge sheet has to be in the language that you demand. It can be very onerous, but the Constitution says so, and that is obeyed. And then I think that gives people a degree of access, and then they are not disadvantaged. Just want to say, just as a little thing, is that in as much as there are those that who have a huge problem of inequality, there's a big problem of lack of access to justice for many poor people. But the one thing that is to the advantage of South Africa in the medium to long term, can be disadvantaged to a certain extent because people demand, is that people are very, very aware of their rights. From the poorest of the poor to the most illiterate, people know that they have a right. I have a right to water. I have a right to health. I have a right to decent housing, etc., etc. And people actually take those rights very seriously. What lacks is the ability to enforce those rights and to access those rights, and that's where they are failed. But I think because of the strong civil society movement and the ability of NGOs to help people, and a lot of the time there have been class actions where those rights have been accessed. But at the end of the day, it has been a great investment that South Africa has done over the past 25 years, telling people that they have rights and those rights are enforceable. The corollary of that is that sometimes people try to demand those rights in a very wrong way, and what I was talking about the protests earlier on.
Just very, very quickly, the United States, of course, has immigrants from every nation on earth, and so the multiplicity of languages is everywhere. And one key component of access to justice is the provision of translation services in the various courts, and it's a costly consideration, and courts are struggling with the cost of providing that kind of translation services. But it is an essential component if you're going to have access to justice to provide those language services.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists, to Alex for the presentation, to all of you for being here and your interest in this work. We hope this conversation will continue. You have a flyer in your materials where you can subscribe to updates from WJP, and we hope you'll take advantage of that and stay in touch and share your thoughts about where we go with this research agenda and the action that follows. Thank you.